For Mississauga Streetsville.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm honored to once again have the opportunity to speak to my private member's bill, Bill C-247. Although I respect and appreciate the work of the Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights, I must say I am disappointed by their report. It is clear that impaired driving is a serious problem in Canada. Sadly, we are reminded of this much too frequently. This past holiday season, the Peel Regional Police, the police force that is tasked with keeping my riding safe, caught more than 400 impaired drivers between November 15th and January 2nd. The current laws that we have in place to address impaired driving are ineffective and do not serve as a deterrent, as many Canadians continue to drive under the influence of alcohol. Survey data and criminal justice statistics indicate that on average, a person can drive impaired once a week for more than 3 years before being charged with an impaired driving offense. This is unacceptable and demonstrates the need to increase deterrent measures for impaired driving. Despite what is included in the committee's report, I strongly believe that legislating passive alcohol sensors is an effective means of improving deterrent measures. Currently, Canadian police forces rely on their own unaided senses to determine whether they have the legal grounds to administer a roadside sobriety test. They rely on observations such as alcohol, flushed face, and slurred speech. A sobriety checkpoint where the majority of these interactions between a peace officer and driver take place, they're under immense pressure to speed up the process in order to prevent the impediment of traffic. It may be difficult for an officer to detect some of these characteristics. This increases the potential for impaired drivers to go undetected. Passive alcohol sensors would enhance the officer's ability to detect impaired drivers. Although the committee was skeptical of this claim, research has proven it to be true. Referring back to an academic study, it indicated that in comparison to sobriety checkpoints where passive alcohol sensors were not used, sobriety checkpoints with passive alcohol sensors had an 88% higher detection rate. In their report, the committee stated, and I quote, "Costs of introducing such devices and the time and resources required for developing the appropriate testing mechanism for them outweigh the potential benefits." Let me just say that one more time. Costs of introducing such devices and the time and resources required for developing the appropriate testing mechanisms for them outweigh the potential benefits. Now, please allow me to quote a July 2016 article in which the National Post reported, "Despite years of public messaging about the dangers of drinking and driving, Canada ranks #1 among 19 wealthy countries for percentage of roadway deaths linked to alcohol impairment. The finding by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control should serve as a warning to lawmakers that new strategies are needed to combat impaired driving, which remains the top criminal cause of death in Canada." Moving to the second part of Bill C-247, which proposes to amend subsection 255, subsection 3 and subsection 3.1 of the Criminal Code from impaired driving causing death and blood alcohol level over legal limit death to vehicular homicide as a result of impairment, I was disappointed to see that the committee did not address this portion of the bill in its report. As I have mentioned in my previous speeches, what inspired me to present this bill was a local high school teacher in my riding who lost his life while out on a bicycle ride. Throughout my time conducting research for Bill C-247, I came across Canadians from coast to coast to coast who shared their story on how impaired driving had impacted their lives. While I was doing this, I came in contact with an organization called Families for Justice, led by a woman named Marquita Collias. Marquita created Families for Justice shortly after the death of her daughter Cassandra, who was killed by a drunk driver while driving home from a baseball game. The organization provides support for families who have been victims of impaired driving. In addition to this, Families for Justice is an advocate for government initiatives to prevent impaired driving. I was glad that Marquita was given the opportunity to testify before the committee and share her story. Sadly, every year the number of families that join Families for Justice grows unacceptably. With every family that contacts Marquita to join her cause, she is reminded of her beautiful young daughter, who had her entire life ahead of her. She was engaged to be married, was in school to be a teacher and had her whole life ahead of her, which was carelessly taken away by a driver who decided to drive after consuming alcohol. Through working with Marquita, I also got to know a woman by the name of Sherry, who had her own devastating experience with impaired driving, which led to the loss of her son, Brad. For Marquita and Sherry, one of the most difficult aspects of these tragic events are the sentences that were given to the people that took their children from them. The driver in Cassandra's death was released from custody after only 2 years in her 3-year sentence. The driver in Brad's case will be eligible for full parole later this month, 2 years and 8 months into his 8-year sentence. The danger of impaired driving is not a new phenomenon. It is common knowledge that when you drive after consuming alcohol, you are putting everyone else around you at risk. It is for this reason that I feel it is time to call this horrific crime for what it truly is, and that's a homicide. It is time that our government changes our criminal code to better reflect the impact these crimes have on the lives of its victims. For Marquita, Sherry, and the family of the teacher from my riding, the connotation of offenders' actions should be on par with the amount of suffering they have gone through. These families view these crimes as a homicide, and it's about time we do as well. While the Justice and Human Rights Committee have recommended that the House does not proceed further with this bill, I want to call on all my members in our government to implement legislation to address impaired driving. As years go by, more families like Marquita's and Sherry's go through the same devastating tragedy. We as a government have a responsibility to all Canadians to address this very serious issue.